Alrighty, I'm Micah Kunkle, and I'll be your affirmative today. And you can come up.
Okay. And I am Anthony Fitzgerald. I'm going to be your negative. And once again, thank you all so much, judges, for volunteering your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for judging. Alrighty. So if Anthony is ready. All right. And all the judges? Awesome. I got 6 minutes. All right, let's begin. You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American. Ronald Reagan. It is because I agree with our 40th president that I stand resolved. Culture ought to value assimilation over multiculturalism. To clarify the round, let's present a few definitions. Culture is defined as the ideas, values, and social behavior of a particular people or society. Assimilation, defined as the integration of immigrants into a larger society or culture. Multiculturalism, defined as the view that cultures, particularly those of minority groups, should be socially distinct from the larger culture. Resolutional analysis is that of affirmative burden. Affirmative burden. Subpoint A underneath this is majority rule. Majority rule. The affirmative burden, simply put, it's to prove that in the majority of cases, assimilation should be prioritized over multiculturalism. That means when we look at today's round, we are asking what the larger society should be doing with immigrants, immigrating into their country. Subpoint B is immigrants' choice. Immigrants' choice. By far the most common type of immigration is voluntary, meaning people have a choice to move or not. This means that most immigrants knowingly choose to immigrate, meaning they are seeking a better life, which leads me to my subpoint C, which is that of immigrate up. Immigrate up. The majority of immigration is to developed regions like the US and Western Europe, over places like Iran or China, which have more people leaving. The resolution means that the affirmative is not defending cases where people assimilate into dangerous regions, since they constitute a small minority of cases. The value I will be using today is that of human rights. Human rights, defined by philosopher John Locke as life, liberty, and property. To prove the resolution, I'll be defending two contentions today. Contention one is that assimilation upholds human rights. Assimilation upholds human rights. Every culture needs a sense of unity and shared goals in order for it to properly achieve human rights. When people assimilate and have the same goals and values, they can live together peacefully. We already see this in America through our citizenship requirements, but another example of this is in my application one of Switzerland. Switzerland. Historically, Switzerland has been mostly multicultural. However, it has recently changed its policies to value assimilation. For instance, the government invests a yearly 30 to 40 million Swiss francs into an integration program. According to Swiss Info, this program has preserved Swiss identity by promoting shared fundamental values to the culture as well as established social norms. As USA Today puts it, quote, candidates for citizenship must prove that they are well assimilated in their communities and respect local customs and traditions, end quote. A joint study published this December by Switzerland's Federal Institute of Technology and Stanford University concluded that, quote, successful integration opens the door for immigrants to economically benefit their host countries and strengthen their civil societies, end quote. Furthermore, the study showed that after assimilating, immigrants' annual earnings increased by $5,000 per year. As a result, Switzerland is the 11th safest country and have the 8th lowest crime rates. They have low unemployment at 2.1% and one of the highest GDPs in the world. They have even been named the best country in the world for 3 consecutive years by the US News and World Report. Contention 2 is that multiculturalism harms human rights. Multiculturalism harms human rights. Multiculturalism, by definition, is allowing different cultures to exist in the same society without adopting the larger culture's values and beliefs. This causes a major problem. In a society that values multiculturalism, it will have conflicting goals and values. This harms human rights because it causes a fundamental disagreement, which often leads to violence. Application 2 is that of Swedish refugees. Swedish refugees. Since Sweden opened its borders to all refugees, thousands have come to seek asylum in its cities. This has created vulnerable areas which refer to Sweden's segregated suburbs. Police describe these districts with high crime rates, and multiculturalism is to blame. According to Dr. Peter Tops and Dr. Ronald Vanderwall at the Police Academy, quote, segregated areas have a strong impact on the residents' identity formation, which can lead to crime and a rejection of mainstream society as the standard bearer, end quote. Politico also reports that, quote, crime is intimately linked to the country's failure to integrate its immigrants, end quote. Sweden has since seen a growth in criminal gangs, with 76% being either first or second generation immigrants. Sweden has seen major impacts when it comes to crime. Gang-related gun murders have increased from 4 per year in the early 1990s to around 40 in 2018. The annual number of reported rapes in Sweden has risen by nearly 2,000 in the past decade, mostly being caused by foreign-born offenders. The number of deaths from criminal firearm violence has risen sharply. As Politico puts it, quote, shootings in the countries have become so common, they don't make top headlines anymore. The impact here is that by not encouraging assimilation of people moving to a community, new immigrants will not have the same ideas and won't be in unity with the larger culture, ending with an increase in crime and a harm to human rights. Thank you, and I now stand open for cross-examination.
Alrighty then, so if our judges are ready, I want to see some thumbs up, as well as Micah.
Yes.
And 3 minutes of cross-examination. Let's get started. Great speech, Micah. Really a pleasure debating you. Just a couple of questions regarding some of the things that you said. Let's start off with this application of Sweden.
Yeah.
Now, so specifically, I just kind of want to get to the bottom of this application. You were saying that the communities themselves within Sweden, these suburbs, they were different culturally than the country as a whole. Is that what you're saying?
They're segregated suburbs.
Okay, so the communities were different than the larger country, correct?
Correct.
All right, and that was the main issue with Sweden.
Correct, that they weren't integrating them into the society.
Okay, so the communities were not integrated within the larger society.
Correct.
All right, now let's talk about your resolutional analysis point, that of the affirmative burden. Now, you gave the subpoint A of majority rule. Is that just talking about the majority of circumstances today, or are we proving a general rule for all time?
We're talking about a general rule, and specifically the most amount of cases when assimilation and multiculturalism is happening is when it's immigrants, just purely numbers wise. And so we should be limiting it to immigrants.
Okay, but specifically, are you just bringing up numbers right now, or are we talking about a general rule for really all time?
I mean, I guess a general rule for all time, but again, immigrants is the majority time. And so that's my burden as the affirmative to prove.
Okay, sounds good. Let's go down and talk about your application of Switzerland.
Yeah.
Now, you would agree with me that there are 4 essentially national cultures within the country of Switzerland, correct?
No, there's 4 national languages, but there's certainly one culture.
Right, but we can agree that those 4 national languages are tied to 4 distinct cultures within the country of Switzerland.
If you have evidence for that, you can bring that up. But specifically, Swiss Info, that own program, talked about how there's a Swiss identity and there's shared fundamental values to the culture and established social norms. So they're one large culture.
So which language do they learn?
They can learn any of the 4, actually.
Okay, but you'd agree with me that the 4 are very distinct, in fact, in their cultural practices. You have Italian, French, German, and Romansh. They are different cultures, correct?
Those are different languages. There's not different cultures within Switzerland. Again, if you want to bring up this evidence, you can. But no, there's not distinct cultures within Switzerland.
Okay, and you talked about specifically this quote you brought up from USA Today. Can you read me that quote one more time about assimilation?
Candidates for citizenship must prove that they are well assimilated in their communities and respect local customs and traditions.
Okay, so they have to be well assimilated within their communities, correct? Okay. Now let's go and talk about this value, that of human rights. Now you defined it as life, liberty, and property.
Yeah.
Now, specifically, what was the harm to life within your application of Sweden?
With Sweden, well, gang-related gun murders have increased. Specifically, criminal gangs have increased, so that increases gang violence. And again, the number of deaths from criminal firearm violence has risen sharply.
And how much has it risen to?
I have the evidence for that if you want to see it.
Thank you. No further questions needed. Alrighty. Okay. I'm going to get started with my 3 minutes of negative prep time. Let's start now. Alrighty, no further negative prep time needed. I have 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining for my next negative prep time.
Good. Make sure the microphone is selected.
Okay, cool. Alrighty, can everybody hear me all right? Are we hear me? Okay. Cool. In that case, if all our judges are ready, assume we're all good, as well as Micah?
Yep.
You're all good. All right, and we have 7 minutes for the first negative speech. In that case, I will get started. George Washington once said, "It will be found an unjust and unwise jealousy to deprive a man of his natural liberty on the supposition he may abuse it." This is precisely my position in today's round, that assimilation wrongly deprives essential liberties in the fear that some may abuse them. That's why I'm firmly resolved. Culture ought not to value assimilation over multiculturalism. Before I go into my opponent's case, I'd like to present some arguments for the side of multiculturalism that hopefully demonstrate to you that restricting cultural freedoms is morally wrong. It starts with my value. Now, generally speaking, I'm going to agree with my opponent's value of human rights, but I'm kind of going to have two general responses to it. Number one, liberty is most at stake. Again, number one, liberty is most at stake. And why do we see this? We see this within the second response, that liberty cannot be used for control. Again, liberty cannot be used for control. We see this specific within the context of the resolution, the context of culture. Other cultures can't use the value of liberty in order to restrict other cultural actions. So because of that, I prefer the value of liberty in today's debate now. That being said, I'd like to get into some contentions, or really the main reasons why you should vote for multiculturalism. Contention one you can tag as assimilation harms essential liberties. Again, assimilation harms essential liberties. By nature, assimilatory policies force a person to accept the majority culture's beliefs, values, and practices. Thus, when the majority culture attempts to coerce minority cultures to adopt the same ideas and values, essential individual liberties like freedom of religion, thought, and speech are inherently harmed. Application 1, you can tag as church versus Hialeah. Again, church versus Hialeah. So in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, many Cuban immigrants flocked to the South Florida city of Hialeah, including adherents of Santeria, an Afro-Caribbean religion whose practices include animal sacrifice. This practice went against the existing community culture in the city of Hialeah, so the residents passed local ordinances that required cultural assimilation and forbade Santeria animal sacrifices. Now, the church challenged these ordinances in court, and eventually the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court sided with the church, and Justice Antonin Scalia wrote in his opinion that restricting one's cultural practice harms their liberty and deprives them of that right. Thus, the impact of the community ordinances and the affirmative stance is that they undermine personal freedoms and liberties by banning cultural actions. And indeed, because a culture chooses to assimilate others, it inherently harms their liberty. Thus, it is morally wrong. Contention 2, you can tag as multiculturalism maintains liberty. Again, multiculturalism maintains liberty. And the reason for this is because it allows people to maintain their cultural liberty without being dictated by another culture. Application 2, you can tag as American law. Again, American law. Now here in America, cultural freedom and accommodation are written into our laws. This is because time and again, the Supreme Court has ruled that cultural freedoms are directly tied to our civil liberties. For instance, since some religious groups like Quakers do not swear, the Constitution allows for groups to affirm rather than swear the oath of office. In addition, under the Supreme Court ruling of Meyer versus Nebraska, families are entitled to their own culture and can teach their children any language, not just English. These legal protections for multiculturalism illustrate why America is such a beacon of liberty, or as President Reagan put it, a place where each cultural heritage is respected. That being said, let's get into some of the arguments that Micah made during his speech, starting off with his resolutional analysis of the affirmative burden. Now, again, I'm generally going to agree with this, but I want to make one specific response, which you can tag as general rule. Again, general rule. We shouldn't just be looking at the majority of cases in this exact moment in time, but we should be trying to prove a general rule throughout all of history. That being said, I do want to specifically reference his subpoint B, that of immigrants' choice. Again, and you can tag my response as involuntary is growing faster. Involuntary is growing faster. While I concede that at the moment, more immigrants are voluntarily moving, UN migration statistics demonstrate that involuntary migration is actually growing much faster than voluntary migration. What does this mean? It means that a general rule has to take into account involuntary migration as well, and this is not done by my opponent. That being said, let's get into, again, my response to his value of human rights is that liberty is most at stake, so that's what we should be focusing on. That being said, let's take a look at his first contention, that of assimilation upholding human rights. And I specifically want to talk about his application of Switzerland. And I have two responses here. Number one, multicultural country. Multicultural country. Specifically, when we look at the country of Switzerland, it has four very distinct cultures, which I talked about during cross-examination. Now, what was my opponent's response to this? Is that they really adapted only to the community culture. Now, this is going to become important later on in my speech. But for now, I want to make a note that this is actually, the country as a whole, is multiculturalism, or values multiculturalism, because it allows these four national cultures to really have that national say and keep them distinct, not assimilating them into one culture, which is what the affirmative is arguing for. That being said, I'd like to go down into his second contention and specifically address the application of Sweden. Now, I have a couple of responses here. Number one, Sweden is demonstrated by the United States State Department as deemed very safe. So you can tag this response as deemed very safe. Again, Sweden is deemed very safe. And we see that even under my opponent's own evidence, it's a pretty safe country, only raised to 40 murders throughout the entire year. That's pretty good if we look at the context of a lot of other countries where murders are a lot higher. So we can see that the impacts of assimilation wouldn't actually be that bad, or the impacts of multiculturalism aren't that bad. Sure, it's higher, but not significantly higher. That being said, my second response is that the affirmative contradicted himself. The affirmative contradicted himself. He said within Switzerland that they were assimilating to the communities, not the national culture. But within the application of Sweden, he said that the communities were assimilated and had one culture, but the national culture was different. Now, this is exactly the same thing. The communities can be different from the national culture, but the national culture as a whole is different from those communities. So we can see that it's actually a contradiction to say that in one context, the communities were assimilated and that was good, and the other, it was bad. So for these reasons, and because I achieve human rights, specifically that of liberty, I ask for a negative ballot. Thank you. And I now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay, so if Anthony's ready, and all the judges? All right, I'm getting a thumbs up. All right, I got 3 minutes. Let's begin. So let's go to, now did you have a counter value of liberty?
No, essentially what I was saying is that when we look at today's resolution, the most applicable part of human rights is that of liberty.
And why is that?
That's because it's most at stake today.
How is it most at stake?
Right, and that's to my second specific response, which is that liberty really can't be used for cultural.
But how does that mean it's most at stake?
Right, because when we look at the round today, what's most at stake within it? Is it people's lives? No, you've only demonstrated that there's an increase in 40, or an increase in, I believe it's 36 murders per year, which isn't very significant. Is it property? No, it's not. It's liberty, because who's being restricted? It's the people. So that's why it's most at stake within today's round.
Do you agree that liberty is limited?
Sure.
And what is liberty limited by?
Be limited by other people's liberty as well.
Would it be limited by other people's human rights?
Sure.
Would it be limited by a person's right to life?
Sure.
And so then wouldn't that then prove that life is also really important, because that's something that can limit liberty?
Not within culture if there's not a significant stake in it. Like we see today, you've only demonstrated that in one country, there was an increase in 36 murders per year out of a country of millions and millions of people. So if we look at the entire broader context, it's not really at stake in today's debate round.
Okay. Going to your application one of Church versus Hialeah, is that correct?
Yeah.
Specifically, why did you said these immigrants fled?
Yes.
So why did they flee?
So there was a revolution in Cuba.
Okay, so these are refugees then?
Sure, not necessarily, but they came over to the United States.
Okay, but they weren't really immigrating here by choice. They were sort of forced out of their country because of the revolution, correct?
Well, it was their choice to leave because of the revolution.
But that would be a refugee then?
Sure, I mean, you could classify them as a refugee.
Okay. Moving specifically, you talked about how Switzerland is a
Guys, sorry to interrupt. One of the judges' internet went out, so please just hang on a second. Can you pause your timers?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, this is not ideal. We wouldn't normally interrupt, especially in the middle of a cross-ex, but we need to make sure that all of our judges are here.
Nick, you look very thoughtful.
I try to be.
Yeah.
At least look like it, that way I don't have to think as much.
Or else it is going to be a 4-4.
Do we know when they disconnected?
That's actually a good question.
I don't know, Sarah, if you're trying to talk to us, but you're muted. Okay.
Okay, so I just got off the phone with her. Her internet went out, and she's working on getting it reconnected. She said she's trying to join the call right now, but it's, not showing up on this end yet. So,
that's funny.
Yeah, we appreciate your patience.
Yeah, no worries.
No problem.
I have experience.
We don't want what happened with LD quarterfinals. And LD quarterfinals, for any of you that weren't here, one of the rounds, the judge...
I was debating Micah, but I'm not sure I could do it twice.
Yeah, well, the judge disconnected in one of the quarterfinal rounds, and missed enough of it that she couldn't make a decision. So out of a three-judge panel, we only had two decisions. It turned out to be a tie, figures, right? So we ended up having to redo the entire round, which is not fun for anybody. So while we hate to interrupt, we believe this is the preferable option. So we're going to work on getting Trinity connected and back up and running as soon as is humanly, or I guess in this case, it'd be technologically possible.
Right.
Okay, it looks like she's on her way back here. What's up? There she is.
I'm back.
You.
You have audio and video? Can you hear us fine?
Yes, I got it.
Wonderful. The round can progress. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. No problem. No worries at all. Okay. So I guess we'll just be resuming cross-ex then.
Alrighty.
All right. So, okay, to the application of Switzerland.
Okay.
You talked about how it's a multicultural country,
Yep.
correct?
Mhm.
Now, did you have any evidence that there's multiple cultures within Switzerland?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah,
Okay.
I brought up specifically there are really four main cultures that we see in Switzerland.
And so you have evidence for this?
Yes.
Okay, I would love to see that.
Okay.
Specifically, you talked about how there's separate communities within Switzerland. Now, did I ever say that they were assimilating to that specific community?
Yes, you said, quote, candidates for citizenship must be well assimilated in their communities and respect local customs and traditions, end quote.
Sure, but would you agree that the integration program within Switzerland is a national program?
You said that the national program focused on assimilating to communities.
Okay.
Alrighty.
right, can everyone hear me? Oh, okay, there we go. All righty, so if Anthony is ready and all the judges. All right, I got 4 minutes. All righty, let's begin. I'll just be addressing the flow, first addressing my case and then addressing Anthony's. So talking about specifically my RA, he talked about it's a general rule, and I agree, but he also talked about how involuntary is growing faster. And my first response to this is really it's still the minority. It's still the minority. The link he sent, the statistics, it's still actually a very small minority. I believe voluntary immigration is still at 75%. But my second response to this is historically, voluntary immigration has still been the largest form of assimilation or multiculturalism. And so really we shouldn't be looking at refugees because again, this constitutes such a small minority of actual cases. But let's go down. He talked about how liberty is most at stake. And he really agreed to my value, but then also disagreed. And he said, we really should only be focusing on liberty. And so my first response to this is the value of human rights really encompasses all human rights. It encompasses all human rights. And so to achieve it, you have to achieve all three parts. But he talked about how liberty is most at stake. And my response to this is not true. Not true. In CrossX, I asked Anthony specifically, why is liberty or how is liberty limited? And he talked about by other people's right to life. And so when we look at it, life is also majorly at stake because if life is proved as a harm to multiculturalism, then that's something that will limit liberty. So let's go down. He talked about specifically multicultural country and communities. And my first response to this is a national program. A national program. My specific evidence comes from Swiss Info, and it talked about this program has preserved Swiss identity. So this is a national program. Yes, the USA Today quote talked about in their communities, but it's still a national program overall. And he didn't have any evidence specifically talking about how they only assimilate to their local communities. But let's go down into Swedish refugees. He talked about how Sweden is deemed safe. And my response to this is the segregated suburbs. The segregated suburbs. These crime rates are coming from the segregated suburbs, not Sweden as a whole. So yes, Sweden as a whole is safe. But when you look at the actual crime rates within the segregated suburbs, you see that gang violence is rampant. And actually, specifically, police are actually scared to go into these segregated suburbs because they're afraid for their lives. And so when we look at it, it's actually the segregated suburbs. But my second response to this is increased by 10 times. Increased by 10 times. My statistic was 4 and then 40. That's an increase of 10 times the amount of deaths within these Swedish segregated suburbs. But let's go down. He talked about, again, his application of church versus Hialeah. And my first response to this is not the larger culture. Not the larger culture. It's not the larger culture's belief that animal sacrifices is wrong. In America, that's not the larger culture belief. And so really that wouldn't be assimilating to America. But my second response to this is refugees. Refugees. These were refugees fleeing their country because of a revolution. And again, that's a small minority of cases, and that's not the affirmative burden to have to prove. But let's go down specifically to American law. My response to this is a naturalization process. A naturalization process. Actually, in order to become a citizen, you have to learn English, you have to understand US history and government, and you have to take a test for these things, and then you have to pledge an oath of allegiance to the United States. What does this prove? It proves that in the United States, we value assimilation because you have to understand our values, understand our beliefs, and even speak our language, which is that of English. And so looking over the examples, we can see that liberty is limited. It's limited by what? It's by human lives. And since assimilation best upholds human lives and property, I'd ask for an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Alrighty, the negative has 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining of prep time, and I'll get started with that now. Alrighty, no further prep time needed. In that case, can everybody hear me? I have the right audio on. Okay, we're good. Okay, cool. Alrighty, so if I can get a thumbs up from our judges. Awesome, and Micah, you're all ready?
Yep.
Ready, and this is a 6-minute speech. Sounds good. In this final negative speech, I'd really like to address the arguments on the flow and really wrap the arguments up into some key voting issues, really the main reasons why I think you should side with liberty and the negative. So let's start off with this resolutional analysis that Micah provided, saying that it's still a minority of involuntary migration. My first response is that it doesn't prove a general rule. It doesn't prove a general rule. Just because something is the majority of circumstances right now doesn't mean it will always be like that. And it also doesn't mean that it always has been like that. My second response here is that not historically. Historically, most migration actually has been forced. And you can take a look at, as an example of this, you can tag as the Irish famine. The Irish famine. One of the greatest periods of migration to the United States was forced migration because of a famine that went on in Ireland that brought many Irish immigrants to the United States. So historically, actually my opponent is incorrect that a lot of migration has been voluntary when we see that it is involuntary. That being said, let's take a look down at his talking about the value. Now, he said that the value encompasses all human rights and that liberty is not most at stake. My response here is that life is much less at stake. Again, life is much less at stake. The only impact that my opponent brought to life was that there were 40 gun murders in a country of millions upon millions of people. If you look at that in the broader world context, that is insanely good murder statistics, actually. So the only harm of assimilation to life given by my opponent is a fraction really of the harms that are to liberty, which I have demonstrated. Let's now look at his first contention, which he said that this was a national program in Switzerland. My response here is that the government designates 4 national cultures. Again, the government designates 4 national cultures, and this really went unaddressed by my opponent. The fact that within the country of Switzerland, there are 4 main cultural groups. My opponent really dropped this fact. And that being said, let's take a look at his second application, that of Sweden. Now, he responded to one part of my response, saying that these were in the segregated suburbs. My first response here is that they're very small areas. Again, the very small areas and very small impacts to the value of even my opponent's value of life. We see that only 40 gun murders took place under multiculturalism compared to the millions and millions of people within the country. And I'd also like to note that he dropped my response, that of the affirmative contradiction. Again, my opponent dropped the affirmative contradiction that I pointed out of the communities in Switzerland versus the communities in Sweden, where you assimilate to the community in Sweden, but not the larger culture, and that being bad, says my opponent. But in Switzerland, when you assimilate to the community and not the larger culture, that's okay. So this went unaddressed by my opponent and stands in today's debate round. Let's get on to his responses to my case, starting off with his 2 responses to Church versus Hialeah. Number 1, he said that it's not the larger culture. My response here is that this is still an example of assimilation. Again, Church versus Hialeah is still an example of assimilation, and that still flows to the negative side. In response to my second application of American law, he talked about really the naturalization process. I have 2 responses here. Number 1, he ignored my examples. Again, he ignored my examples, talking about the Supreme Court case of Meyer versus Nebraska, completely unaddressed by my opponent. Further, talking about how our civil liberties under the Constitution and Bill of Rights do protect multiculturalism. And my second response is that of the First Amendment. Again, the First Amendment, which is a prime example of how the very First Amendment to the Constitution, the biggest priority for the founding fathers was protecting diversity of thought and different ideas and values and cultures. That demonstrates that we actually do prioritize multiculturalism. That being said, let's get into some key voting issues, or really the biggest reasons why I think you should side with the negative. Starting off with voting issue number 1, liberty is most at stake. Again, liberty is most at stake. Subpoint A under this, you can tag as the affirmative has only talked about 40 lives at most being harmed by multiculturalism. Again, only 40 lives on the line. And if you look at the bigger picture, that's really not that many people. Again, it's definitely a negative impact, but if you look at other countries and their gun violence, Sweden is doing a whole lot better, and multiculturalism hasn't been that harmful. That being said, subpoint B under here, you can tag as multiculturalism outweighs. Multiculturalism outweighs. What do I mean by this? The liberty of people being denied their access to things like their religion, their values, their ideas, that outweighs the fact that only a couple more people died under multiculturalism than assimilation. Voting issue number 2, you can tag as assimilation inherently harms assimilation inherently harms liberty. Again, assimilation inherently harms liberty. And you can tag subpoint A under this as church versus Hialeah. Again, church versus Hialeah. The direct Supreme Court ruling really established this line of reasoning that when a culture chooses to assimilate, it inherently harms your right to liberty. And this was unaddressed by my opponent. Voting issue number 3 is that multiculturalism protects liberty. Again, multiculturalism protects liberty. And we see this right here in America. We have the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has ruled in favor of cultural and religious diversity. So these examples and the impacts and what's at stake here really demonstrate why the negative has won your ballot. My opponent has shown you, yes, there are a couple more murders per year in a country that values a multiculturalism, but they haven't demonstrated why that outweighs the millions and millions of people who are forced under assimilation under his side of the resolution. So for all of these reasons, I would ask for a negative ballot. Thank you.
9-minute prep time starting now. All right, can you hear me? All right, so if Anthony's ready?
Yep.
And all the judges? All right, I got 3 minutes. I'll just address some of the examples on the flow and then getting into some voting issues. So talking to the RA, he talked about how not historically, and then my response to this is one example. one example. Anthony didn't give any numbers. He just pointed to one specific example. That doesn't prove that the majority of cases are refugees. And so when we're looking at today's round, the majority of cases are immigrants choosing to move to a country. I think that's most fair on both sides, and that's really what the affirmative side needs to prove. But going down, he talked about how life is much less at stake. And my response to this ignores other statistics. Ignores other statistics. Of course, I can't go into intricate detail about all the crime statistics in Sweden, but I mentioned how gun violence is on the rise there. Shootings have become so common, they don't make top headlines anymore. It's not just these 40 lives, it's lots of other lives as well. And specifically, he ignored the response of 10 times higher. 10 times higher. Looking over that, that is terrible. Having 10 times the amount of deaths, life is at stake. But going down to Switzerland, he talked about government designates 4 national cultures. My response to this is no warrant. No warrant. He didn't have any warrant for this. And specifically, my evidence talks about, when it comes to Switzerland, it talked about seeking to involve newcomers in the country's daily life instead of creating so-called parallel societies. There's no multiple cultures within Switzerland. They're one whole culture, and that's what my evidence proves. Going down into Sweden, he talked about very small areas, and my response to this is multiculturalism areas. Multiculturalism areas. That's the whole point. These segregated suburbs have so much crime because they're not integrating into society. That's the whole point. And then you can also tag underneath this, again, ignores other statistics. Now let's get into some key voting issues. Voting issue number 1 is that liberty is limited. Liberty is limited. And Anthony never really addressed this response. Liberty is limited by life. And so assimilation, how does it uphold life? Specifically, it upholds life because it creates a peaceful society to live in, because everyone agrees and has the same values and beliefs. And when you think about it, you actually have more liberty when you're alive and when you're prosperous. When you have more money and when you're alive, you have more liberty. And so we can see assimilation achieves all 3. But going into voting issue number 2 is that assimilation benefits both. Assimilation benefits both. When you look at Switzerland, not only does it uphold the larger society, it also helps the immigrants by increasing their annual earnings by $5,000 every year. My third and final voting issue is that multiculturalism inherently harms human rights. Multiculturalism inherently harms human rights. And why is this? It's because it causes a fundamental disagreement, because immigrants do not know the values of that society, and so it leads to crime and a rejection of mainstream society. It is for those reasons I'd urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you. Good job, Anthony.
Well done, Micah. This was the best thing ever.
I would agree. Thank you all so much for judging.
Yes, thank you all so much for volunteering your time today.